I am just delighted to welcome Professor Stephen Kotkin to Politics and Prose tonight. He's the author of 4 previous books. This is the first time we've been lucky enough to get him here at the store. We're thrilled to have him, and he'll be discussing his new book, Stalin, Paradoxes of Power, 1878-1928. Now, I don't know if how many of you are actually holding the book or have seen it or looking at it, but you can undoubtedly tell by looking at it that it is a monumental work. It weaves together complex strands of history, culture, geography, personality, and politics into a full-blown portrait of the at least one stage of Stalin's life. But more than that is also really a thorough portrait of a half-century of world history. This is also, by the way, I think most of you probably know this, the first of what is intended to be a 3-volume complete biography of Stalin. So already he's a third of the way through, and I can only imagine what the next 2 are going to amount to after this one. So he's the John B. Perklin Professor in History and International Affairs at Princeton, a research fellow at Hoover Institution at Stanford. And Professor Kotkin, of course, is not only a specialist in Russian and Soviet history, but also an authority on the larger question of how power exists and evolves in authoritarian regimes. He's interested in the paradoxes of these regimes and in understanding how they seem to straddle a narrow fault line between durability and fragility, control and collapse, success and failure. Obviously, we all know there's no shortage of opinion about the subject of this book. I think that's why there's so many of you here tonight. Joseph Stalin is widely viewed as one of the world's greatest practitioners of evil in the 20th century. Professor Kotkin takes his own intensive and exhaustive look at the man, marshaling enormous research and some historical distance to make a fresh case about Stalin's leadership and influence. I don't know if any of you saw the New York Times review not long ago, but it described Professor Kotkin's book as, and I quote, a riveting tale, one written with pace and aplomb, a textured, gripping examination of the foundational years of the man most responsible for the construction of the Soviet state in all its brutal glory. It is an honor to have Professor Kotkin here tonight. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose.
Thank you so much. Can we hear me? Is this on? It's sort of a shame the introduction's over. I was really enjoying that. And now I don't know if I can live up to that introduction, but that was really fun. That was definitely worth the trip down here. And so let's see what I can do. It's a little bit of a fat book. Penguin says that if you drop it on your foot, you cannot sue. I guess they're having trouble. And some of the trial lawyers are seeing an opportunity here, because it is heavy. But as I say this at every event, as one of my friends says, even though it's 750 pages of text, it reads like no more than 620. The pages just fly by. Maybe some of you know that already. In fact, I know somebody who finished it. I swear, that was truth. That wasn't a joke. You know, so how do you, in a short period of time, communicate what is sort of 11 years of my life, research and writing, volumes 1 and 2. I have a manuscript of volume 2, which covers the years 1929 to 41, and I'm sort of in the final stages of polishing that to get that into print. I wrote volumes 1 and 2 together, starting from Bismarck's unification of Germany to Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. And then I went back to the middle from those 2 endpoints. And so it's obviously not possible to convey in a short period of time sort of what's in the book. So I'll just do a little bit of it, and then we can have the question and answer. So how about if I start this way? You know, when you read a book about a great artist, like an unbelievably great painter, say Picasso or whoever your favorite painter is, or a great novelist, James Joyce or whoever, I don't want to insult anybody, but whoever your favorite novelist, or the greatest poet you like. And you read a book and it's a biography and it goes into detail, and it turns out, you know, difficult relationship with the mother and difficult relationship with the father, and mistress or failure to have a mistress. Right, that's sort of that's that category I fall into. That second one. Or some teacher humiliated them when they were young in school. And then you're reading and you think, that can't be it, because I had a difficult relationship with my father, and I didn't paint anything like Picasso or write any novels like James Joyce, right? I mean, there's got to be more. If it was just about having a difficult relationship or being humiliated in school, all my stuff would be hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So there's got to be some other way to get at these transcendental productions, these transcendental creations, than the kind of psychology of their young years. And so if you think about Stalin's dictatorship, the accumulation of power and the exercise of power, it's a transcendental work of art. There's no dictatorship that's greater than Stalin's dictatorship. Nobody accumulated or exercised more power than Stalin. And so he is, as it were, the Picasso of dictatorship, or the James Joyce of dictatorship. And what happens often in Stalin's biographies is this amazing amount of power that he built and exercised then gets explained by the fact that he was maybe beaten by his father, or had a difficult time in the seminary, or whatever it might be. And I read all these Stalin biographies, and there are many of them, and some of them are good. And probably you've read some of them too. And I thought, that can't be it, though. Because, my father beat me. And I have not killed 10 million people yet. Although I guess there's time. So I was looking for some other way to write the story of this big personage. And so the strategy that I took on the one hand was to widen the perspective. So instead of opening up with his childhood as the dominant trope, I open up with the world into which he's born. So, in the 1870s, Bismarck unifies Germany, and now there's one dynamic great power on the continent. And in the 1870s, there's the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which is not a new country, it's not a unification, but it is a transformation, tremendous new dynamism, consolidation of Japanese nation. And these, of course, are eruptions in world history, and they take place on either side of Russia. And the 1870s is the decade Stalin is born. So instead of going into speculative, psychological, or even the known facts of his childhood as the launch point, I launch with the big story, the world history, the geopolitics, the world into which he's born and which he's eventually going to shape. But it's going to take a while. He's not going to shape the world and his youth. He's born in 1878, and the Bolshevik seizure of power is October 1917. So he's in his 39th year before he gets near power. And so a lot of people with those first 39 years, they either give you the sort of psychology version, the psychological version, or they just skip those years entirely. But those are the years in which big history happens in the world, and so Stalin is not the key figure in the early part of the book. Because the argument of the book is that those big world processes are going to shape the person he becomes, and he in turn is going to shape that world. He's going to transform that world into which he's born. So if you take an example, World War I. Without World War I, you can't have someone born in the periphery of the Russian Empire to a shoemaker and a washerwoman getting to be in charge of the largest state in the world. World War I brings down the old order. It destroys the old world. This enables Stalin to get near power. But what does he do in World War I? He's in northeastern Siberia, battling boredom and mosquitoes. He's on the boredom and mosquito front of World War I. He never gets into the army. He never fights a single battle. He never does anything of significance between 1914 and 1917. He's in the wastes. But without that story of what happened in the war, in his absence, while he's in eastern Siberia, I don't think you can understand how, as I say, he gets near power. So this is a story, as it were. It's a kind of world history or a global history and a history of Russian power in the world, as well as Stalin's power in Russia. So that's a sort of by way of opening how I thought I could widen the horizons a little bit, widen the purview, and maybe say something new about this character. The other thing that I tried to do, which is not all the other biographies have done, if you're familiar with them, is instead of the personality giving you the politics, it's the politics that gives you the personality. It's the experience of building a dictatorship and exercising power that creates the person that we know. So, when you have that kind of power, when you have life or death power over more than 200 million people, it has an effect on you. We know what it's like, in smaller organizations when you have that kind of power. But when you're a dictator, a personal dictatorship inside this Bolshevik regime, which he builds, and you have control over everything, the secret police, the military, the entire rest of the state, all the embassies abroad. And when, by your decision, people live or die, whole nations are deported, 100 million plus peasants are enslaved in what's called collectivization. Do you think exercising that kind of power could have had an effect on his personality? And I think the answer is yes. So I tell the political story, and then you can finally begin to see the person. You can begin to see who he is as a result of building this dictatorship and exercising this power. Like I said, it's the gold standard of dictatorships. It's a transcendental work of art, what he's created. Not in a moral sense. There's no way that I identify with this regime in moral terms. I don't share the politics of Stalin. However, if you're interested in power, accumulation of power, and exercise of power, it is quite a dramatic, sensational story, and he's quite a spectacular dictator in that regard. So you have to try to convey that from the inside with the original materials that we now have in abundance, which used to be secret. So there are probably 3,000 or 4,000 endnotes in the book to original primary sources, military archives, police archives, Communist Party archives, as well as the memoir literature that has been declassified, brought out into the public realm in the past approximately 15 years or 20 years, and they continue to declassify materials. So just to finish this point about what I thought I was doing in the book and how I approached Stalin's biography, I was in Moscow recently in December, and as I'm working on Volume 2, and one of the episodes in Volume 2 is the Spanish Civil War, when Franco does the putsch in 1936. The putsch fails, and it devolves into a civil war, and from 36 to 39, they fight a civil war in Spain, and Franco, as you know, will be victorious by March, April 1939. But Stalin will intervene on behalf of the Spanish Republic that's under attack from the putschists, from the insurgents. And they just declassified recently the super secret documents of Stalin's participation in the Spanish Civil War. So I just saw those in December when I went to Moscow. So there's just a tremendous amount of material that's come out that's overwhelming in scale to assimilate of this new documentation, and that combined with the approach of treating it as a political story that makes the person and as a wide-angle lens on Russian power in the world, who had their hands on the wheel of state before Stalin, and what they tried to do or what they failed to do, and therefore what lessons he might have learned or mislearned when he then had that position, which he built, as I said, himself, right? We think of dictatorship as something that just happens. Democracy fails and dictatorship happens. But, the experience of Iraq taught many people, if you didn't know already, that building a democracy is really hard. Building the institutions to endure is very difficult. Well, building a dictatorship is also very hard. It's not a pretty thing necessarily. We're not talking about something to cheer on, but it doesn't just happen automatically. It has to be built. And so he's very skillful at building dictatorship. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of stuff that I found, which is in the book, and then maybe we'll go to questions at that point, if that's okay. All right. So, I mean, a lot of episodes that I could latch on to, but I'll tell you a little bit about the differences between Stalin and Trotsky that I illuminated in the book. Well, Trotsky is a fantastic figure, brilliant in many ways. He's kind of a shooting star, tremendous charisma, really fantastic character. But in the historical moment that we're in, he's nothing compared to Stalin. Let me give you an example. They're fighting the Civil War. It's the years 1918 to 21. And Trotsky is the head of the army. He's the war commissar. He's the most prominent figure after Lenin. Stalin has a very big role in the Civil War, but Trotsky's the top guy in the army. And some secret police guy comes to visit Trotsky's train. Trotsky's commanding the Civil War on the front in an armored train, famous Trotsky's train. And he says to Trotsky, his name is Menjinsky, and this character Menjinsky, who is an ethnic Pole, all the names in the book are in the original. They're not Russified. So you can tell it's a multinational empire. The Latvians have the Latvian spelling of their name. The Poles have the Polish spelling of their name. This was on purpose. Menjinsky is a great character. He paints his fingernails red. He wears a Persian kaftans. He's learning Persian language. He studied 14 different languages. He, however, was hit by a car in Paris before the revolution, and so he can't really stand up, and so he's in the secret police. He's going to be head of the secret police soon, but he has to receive everybody lying down on a couch, a Turkish divan, with the painted red fingernails and the kaftan on, and he's the leader of the secret police from 1926 to 34. The book is full of people. Revolution produces people like this. And so Menjinsky comes to Trotsky's train in the Civil War, and he says to Trotsky, Stalin is pouring poison into Lenin's ear behind your back. Which, of course, is true. And Trotsky could have known that without Menjinsky coming to tell him. But Menjinsky works in the secret police, and he's come voluntarily to Trotsky. Trotsky is offended. You're gossiping, he says. What are you doing? You're doing the same thing Stalin is doing. You're talking behind someone's back. And Menjinsky is stupefied. What would Stalin have done if Menjinsky came to him and said, Trotsky is pouring poison into Lenin's ear behind your back? Well, Stalin would have said, that's very interesting. Tell me more. And can you, when you go back to the capital, can you watch over this and report to me again? And is there anybody else who could help you watch over this question to see what Trotsky is telling Lenin? Stalin would have seized the moment of Menjinsky coming to him voluntarily and making him into one of his allies. So when Stalin gets into power, builds the personal dictatorship, this is precisely what he's going to do. People ask me, when did Stalin become a dictator? It's an excellent question. It's the one I set out to answer in the middle part of the book. And in April 1922, so now he's 44 years old almost, it's his 43rd year, he gets appointed General Secretary of the party, and then the next month, May 1922, Lenin has a stroke. So that's it. The number one guy has a stroke the next month after he appointed him number two. So Stalin's in this position of power from spring 1922, and he begins to write. Menjinsky is the number two guy in the secret police now. Dzerzhinsky, another Pole, is number one. And Stalin initiates a correspondence with the number three guy of the secret police, asking him if he could keep an eye on numbers 1 and 2. And then, after that guy says yes and gets involved with Stalin, Stalin then finds the person who hates the number three guy the most and initiates a correspondence and promotes him. And he says, you know, that number three guy, I don't really like him. Why don't you keep an eye on him? And this goes on. He does this in the army. He does this in the local party. He does this everywhere. So, you know, dictatorship is a special skill set. It's not a skill set that everybody has, but it's perceiving opportunity, seizing opportunity, turning it to your advantage. You know, what the Prussian military strategists of the 19th century called strategy. That was their definition of strategy, which is to perceive and seize opportunities, things you don't create, but that come your way. And all of a sudden, it's in front of you. This guy comes and tells you, Menjinsky comes and tells you that Stalin is pouring poison into Lenin's ear behind your back, and you seize that opportunity and you turn it to your advantage, or you misperceive, you don't seize the opportunity. You don't regard it as an opportunity. So up and down the regime, up and down examples, Stalin is doing this again and again and again, and he's going to build this personal dictatorship basically from the ground up. And as I said, it's absolutely breathtaking to see him do this and to see the amount of power he's exercising. So, you know, they don't like the fact that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are independent countries. They've broken off from the Tsarist regime. They've become independent states after World War I. They don't get folded back into the Soviet Union. Stalin doesn't like this. And there's another Pole who speaks German named Josef Unschlicht. And Stalin and Unschlicht are hanging out, and they say, why don't we do a coup in Estonia? Why don't we overturn that regime? Put our own people in there. And so Unschlicht, they get some money, they buy some weapons, they infiltrate 100 gangsters into the country to do a coup. This is January 1924. It fails. It fails miserably, showing you that Stalin is no genius. Right? He's not good at everything. But this is what this regime is like. Here is another country, a foreign country, a sovereign country. He's having a conversation with this guy Unschlicht, who's close to Stalin, and they decide to do a coup in another country. So we think of this regime, you know, they have meetings, they have a Politburo, they have a Communist Party, they have this and that, but it's this one guy at the center who's moving everything at once. All these balls going up into the air. All these intrigues he's got going on. He's got a phenomenal memory. Names, faces, places. People are coming to his office begging for positions, begging for jobs because they see that he's got the power, that he's the one, that if you attach yourself to him, you could be going places because he's working 20 hours a day, because he's controlling all the various different mechanisms. It's a breathtaking story. However, this is where we'll end this part of the presentation. The book builds to the decision to collectivize agriculture. Now, as most of you know, in 1929, they launch a violent forced collectivization of agriculture, and they end up eliminating private or individual peasant household agriculture, forcing them into these collectives. Where there are no collective farms, they create state farms. So meaning that there had been no farms there before, and they're called state farms. Collective farms are where there had been individual farms before, and they force them into a collective. And so the book is building towards this decision, which is the core crime of this regime, which is the enslavement of the peasantry. They lose more than 50% of their livestock. 5 to 7 million people die in a famine. Stalin's own dictatorship is destabilized as a result of this episode. And I'm going to try to explain in the book where the power comes from to enact collectivization and where the logic or the decision-making comes from to think that this is good or necessary to do. And so there's a second revolution that's taken place besides the Bolshevik Revolution. There's an urban communist seize power, build socialism, eventually get you to communism. But there's also a peasant revolution where they've seized the land from the landowners, and they've done it themselves, and then they're done once they seize the land. They don't want to be part of the Bolshevik urban revolution. And so these two revolutions are in parallel. They're separate. And the regime is unable to control the peasantry, unable to rule over the peasantry, and concedes a quasi-market known as the New Economic Policy. The New Economic Policy. This happens beginnings of actually 1920, before it's even announced, and then 1921, 22, 23, they continue to issue decrees legalizing market behavior because they break their teeth on the peasant revolution. They can't overcome the peasant revolution. But as the story of the 20s goes, it moves more and more to Stalin deciding that they have to take on the countryside, they have to take on the peasant markets, they have to take on the capitalism and market behavior in the countryside, because this is an avowedly communist regime building socialism towards communism. But the rest of the people inside the regime, they believe that you can't do this. You see, because in 1928, 1% of the arable land is collectivized. That's voluntary collectivization. And it's all the farmers who can't succeed on their own. And they've joined these collectives, but all the farmers who can manage are not joining collectives. So your average household of a collective farm is about 16 to 17. It's the lowest productivity, as I said, 1% of the arable land. So they have a knockdown, drag-out fight behind the scenes. All the secret documents we now have about this struggle. And Stalin is saying, are we communists or not? Are we going to live with the market? Did we have the revolution and civil war in order to produce kulaks or rich farmers? Are we going to allow wage slavery? That is to say, for better off farmers to hire the other farmers? Or are we going to be true to our ideals and press forward on collectivization? And there's this great character named Alexei Rykov. And Alexei Rykov is the second most powerful person in the regime. Lenin has died in January 1924. And Alexei Rykov says, you know, I don't love the peasants. I'm a communist too. But if you try this thing, this coercive agriculture, this coercive collectivization, it's going to fail. It's going to be catastrophic. It's not going to work. And we're going to ruin the recuperation of the new economic policy. And there's a very dramatic moment inside the regime. Stalin has built the personal dictatorship, but he doesn't have anything close to a majority of supporters at the top, let alone in the locale, for collectivizing this agriculture. And so, what's he going to do? They go back and forth, back and forth. Rykov saying not collectivization is wrong, but that it will fail. And it's a wrong thing to do at this time. There's no Bolshevik inside the top of the regime who says that markets are okay, private property is okay, peasants owning their own land is okay. None of them say that. They're all communists. What they do say, however, is we can't do it. We can't win. We can't succeed. We'll ruin everything. We'll destroy everything. So Stalin does it anyway. He goes out to Siberia. This is where the book ends. He announces he's in a room. It's a room about half the size of this. And it's the party bosses of the Siberian region where they grow a lot of grain. And he says to them, you know, we need to modernize. We need more grain. We need a bigger harvest. But we can't do that with kulak or private farms like they do in America because we're a socialist country. So we're going to have to collectivize to modernize right now. And the room is shocked. They can't believe he's saying this because none of them think this is possible. He forces it down their throat. He goes back to Moscow. He stirs up a tremendous state of siege in the country. And he enacts this collectivization. He launches this process. And who's right? Rykov is right. The guy who said it was going to be catastrophic is right. Famine, death of as I said, of the livestock. 50 to 70% of the livestock, 5 to 7 million at a minimum. That's from famine, but 40 million people starve and survive. Stalin's own personal dictatorship is destabilized because now there's opposition to him inside the regime, circulating secret documents calling for him to step down or be overthrown. Does he stop? Does he say, you know, I made a mistake? Rykov was right. We can't do this? No. He goes all the way to the end, through the famine, through the murder of the livestock, through the destabilization of the regime, until it's 100% collectivization. He doesn't wince. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't allow them to admit there's a famine. And the reason is not because he's trying to murder people on purpose, not because he is inherently sadistic. It's because he believes in building communism. And he's doing this for an idea. And they all agree with the idea. They just don't think the time is ripe to enact the idea. But there's no disagreement in the idea, but he goes through with it even though it's horrific. He's got willpower in a tragic way that none of the other ones had. And so here's a guy who's built this power for himself, and then he uses that power to do this crazy, but from his point of view, necessary and just and right destruction of capitalism, destruction of the markets, destruction of private property, building of collective farms in the countryside. More than 100 million people are enslaved in this process. Think about the scale of what this is. This is 1928 that this decision is made. Lenin is only dead since January 1924. Stalin is only general secretary of the party since spring 1922. This is 6 years on from that, right? And it's just a colossal, unbelievably, how do you wrap your eyes around the fact that your head around the fact that he tried this, let alone that he pushed it all the way through. So in history, there are some figures who are just bigger even than the larger structural forces at play. There are some people, and Stalin is one of the few, and this is a small category, who can drive history in a direction it was not otherwise going, using tremendous willpower and galvanizing forces in the society. Anyway, maybe that's enough for the presentation, and I will take questions.
Yeah, very interesting. My wife's father was in the Lincoln Brigades in Spain.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you'd expand a little on what's been found out from the documents that have been released about Stalin's row. And it's always a little murky with the Lincoln Brigade. I think they're heroes, but, were they Stalinists first? And you better answer this right or I'll be in trouble with my wife. But
Okay, that's, I got to be careful here.
No.
That's a big one. So, the Spanish Civil War is mythologized, both on the left and on the right. And it's this moment of, struggle between fascism and socialism, or fascism and the left, right? Orwell, Franz Birkenau. There's just a tremendous amount of writing, and people participated in the Spanish Civil War. And the view we have now, basically, is Stalin was cynical. He didn't really believe in what he was doing. He was unsure, not supporting the left necessarily, against the revolution in Spain. This is kind of what Orwell writes. And so this is what we know now from the secret documents. This is volume 2, but I just finished this chapter, so it's fresh for me. So from the secret documents, he sold to Spain his best military equipment. Absolute best stuff. Meaning the best planes, the best tanks. He sent pilots and tank drivers to help the Spanish in the battle. There's no way Madrid is held in the fall of 1936 without the Soviet equipment. So doesn't look cynical from the inside. You can read the military file of the list that Voroshilov, the head of the military, gave to Stalin. We're going to send this many of tanks and this many of this jet fighters and this and that. And Voroshilov says, it hurts me to part with this stuff because we need this stuff ourselves. And Stalin's signature is on that list of stuff. The Spanish have to pay for it. And they pay with gold, with the Spanish Empire, the Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish Empire gold that's been accumulated over the centuries gets shipped to Moscow and pays for the weapons that Stalin sells him. But so Stalin is in this for real, at least at the beginning, and the emotionalism is there, and each side both the right and the left, because the right is the church and its traditional values, the Catholic Church. The left is more the one that gets played up, but the right also has an emotional attachment to the Civil War. It's a tragedy because the Spanish Republic is overthrown by Franco, who claims there's a threat from the left, and it's the Spanish overthrowing of the Republic, it's Franco's putsch that creates the communist threat that Franco now is using to have justified the original putsch in the first place. So crazily enough, there's no communist threat in Spain that Franco is using to argue for the putsch until he does the putsch. And now he creates the leftist revolutionary situation, and then he's going to go out and solve it, which he does in his brutal fashion. And unfortunately, the Lincoln Brigades and all those who fight on the left, they don't have the same level of sophistication in some of the military battles towards the end of the war, and they're going to lose and get evacuated. And Spain is going to be a tragedy from all sides. But Franco is more sophisticated in running the insurgency and a government than the left is on their side of the story. But Stalin made a major contribution militarily, even if the Spanish paid for it in gold. There's much more to the story than that, but that's a piece of it.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm so glad that the gentleman asked this question about Spain, because it is related directly with what I'm going to ask.
Yes.
After collapse of communism in Russia, there was a plethora, storm of new books on Stalin and communism,
Yes.
and many of them were, you would call revisionists, I would call
Yes.
it revelations, and basically two names stand out dramatically in all this storm: Viktor Suvorov and Mark Salonin, who are you familiar with these names? What is your position, and did you include anything from what they said?
Yeah, so there's a controversy about whether Stalin was prepared for World War II and whether he knew it was coming and, he knew Hitler was going to attack. Was he reading the intelligence? Was he taking it seriously, or did he mess up the situation? There's a further argument that he himself was preparing to attack Hitler and that Hitler just beat him to the punch. So this is the end of the second volume. It's not in the volume that's on sale now. And the answer is I've now seen all that documentation in the original hand, and Stalin is not planning an attack on Hitler. There is no actual documentation to show that Stalin was trying to attack Hitler.
There is, I can give you...
Yeah, I've read the Vasilievsky plan from May 15th, 1941. There's no signature on it. Stalin didn't sign the plan. Vasilievsky didn't sign the plan. You look at the Zhukov files, which we've been able to read in the military archive. I mean, I could go on with this. You look at the commentary of other people who were taking notes of the government meetings. We have a tremendous amount of documentation on this, and we also have fabricated documents. We've got a lot of fabricated documents in the public realm. We have 2 volumes of Beria diaries that were never written, that were published. And we have a tremendous amount of documents on this question if Stalin was preparing the war. So we're going to disagree here because I see that you believe this is true. And, that's your right to believe it. But, I had no view either way until I read the documentation. And now I'm persuaded that Stalin was not willing to attack. And that, in fact, even after the Germans attacked, he was trying to undo the war that had started. He was afraid. He was afraid of Hitler. He was scared out of his wits. But like I said, I see you have a different opinion, but I think we're just going to have to disagree on that.
So from what I've read of Stalin, which is probably nowhere near what you have, it seems to me...
I'll give you that.
It seems to me that his move to collectivize the agriculture in the Soviet Union was much more about control than it was about communism, because a lot of what he did seemed like it was more in a totalitarian vein than as a communist vein, and he just used the communist ideology to justify his demand for power.
Yes, that's the interpretation we have. I see you have read on this. That's what people currently argue. That's the point of view that's most widespread. But here's the problem with that point of view. declassified the secret archives. So now we can go in and see what they were talking about when they were behind closed doors and they didn't expect anybody to ever find out what they were talking about. And so they could be truthful and free among each other. And you read those documents, Stalin's discussions, Rykhov's discussions, all the inside discussions, and what do you think? It turns out that when they're behind closed doors, speaking among themselves, they use exactly the same language vocabulary as the communist propaganda that's in the public realm. Meaning, class warfare, finance capital, kulak, wage slavery, diabolical market. You can imagine if they're behind the scenes and they don't believe in this stuff, they could say, oh, finally we can relax. All that garbage about communism and finance capital and I don't know what else, that nonsense in Pravda. You know, finally we can kick back and really it's just about control and it's just about whatever, personal power. But in fact, that's not what they talk about. In the secret documents, they talk as if they have communist convictions. And let's take this a step further. It turns out that Stalin's collectivization destabilizes his regime. He begins to create opposition to his regime. Collectivization is actually a risk. He's already got a dictatorship. One of the things I hope at least, you'll tell me in volume 1 that I prove is that he's exercising dictatorial power already in the mid-1920s. So the idea that he had to control more inside the regime is not consonant with the picture that we have. And the idea that he's doing this only for control rather than for communism is not consonant with the secret documents. Now, do they get control over the countryside as a result of dictatorship? Yes, they do. They do. Collectivization delivers them control over the village. But it's very inefficient. The harvest actually shrinks. Once they have control, why don't they allow market behavior? Now they've implanted control. If the argument that you're referring to, which is the dominant argument in the literature, is correct, once the control is implanted, then they can say, let's go for efficiency and a bigger harvest and more money. Let's allow within the control that we're asserting, and they had many mechanisms of control, machine tractor stations, control over the seeds, control over the silos, control over the distribution networks. They can allow market behavior to raise productivity while retaining control once they implant control. But they don't. And I think they don't because they're communists. But maybe you disagree.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to say that, Stalin's definitely not above altering evidence. If you look at the same photo year to year, you'll see people disappearing. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question you raise about the evidentiary base of the regime. We got a lot of stuff that doesn't look good. If I were Stalin, I would have destroyed it. We have 370-something lists, execution lists, with 40,000 names, with his signature on it. I wouldn't have kept that. You know, so there is a problem with falsification of documentation, but actually we have a surfeit of legitimate documentation. We have an avalanche of legitimate documentation. But your point is taken that one has to be careful with the documents. Are we on this side?
Hi. I was recently reading a book on Russian history and came upon an anecdote that was quite striking to me. In the 40s, the midst of the Second World War, Stalin called in the movie director Eisenstein, who was doing a revision and reissue of his movie on Ivan the Terrible.
Yeah.
And there's a transcript of this.
Yes.
And Stalin says, "You've made him too weak. You need to make him more dramatic and forceful. I don't want him to be a Hamlet."
Yes.
Now, I understand he was a political master, but I thought he was an ill-educated thug. How does he know the character Hamlet? Do you know?
Yeah, so Stalin, you know, too much of Stalin is the cynical view about he's only after personal power, just what we heard in the previous question. And too much of it is the Trotsky view, that Trotsky was a genius and Stalin was a moron, and I don't know how he beat me in the political struggle, right? So Trotsky was a great writer. Trotsky lived until 1940. And so Trotsky was able to define Stalin internationally in a way that my book, I hope, goes against that and brings more of the original information. So Stalin was no worse educated than Trotsky. Trotsky did not complete university education. Stalin was very well read. He was an autodidact. Stalin was the star pupil in elementary school, had the highest grades, and he was the teacher's pet. He sang in the choir, and he got into the seminary, which was the highest educational institution along with the gymnasium in the Caucasus. They didn't have a university in the Caucasus. And he read, one of the reasons he gave up God was because he read Darwin, for example, when he was in the seminary. Now, is Stalin a genius? No. Is Stalin's interpretation of Shakespeare the best interpretation of Shakespeare I've ever seen? No, it's not. He's not a genius. In fact, he gets a lot of things wrong. He gets fascism wrong. And if you're going to be in charge of this country in that time period and you get fascism wrong, that's a pretty big thing to get wrong, right? It's like getting Iraq wrong or getting something big like that wrong. That's going to stamp your rule through the annals of history for a long time. But no, he's very well read, and he continues to read. He line edits novels and screenplays. He edits films which are shown to him in the Kremlin cinema. He decides scenes to cut, scenes not to cut. Sometimes his judgment is poor. Sometimes his judgment is spot on. And his greatest love is music. So this is really volume 3, which I haven't written yet. But what the hell, right? It's the end of a long day. I've been here since this morning in this great town. I was in the State Department this morning, which it turns out it looks like a mental hospital in there.
It is.
They got these white walls and this color coding, like this way to surgery and that kind of stuff. So and also my medication is wearing off at this point. So I'm liable to say anything. But let me just finish that point about Stalin's greatest love is music. And so if you go through the Gulag, you can get a ballet troupe. The Gulag are the forced labor camps. The people who've been arrested for crimes they didn't commit and deported to the wastes of the North and the East. And you can get a Bolshoi ballet style ballet troupe. You can get a Moscow art theater style art theater group in the Gulag in the slave labor camps. But the one thing you can't get is an orchestra. If you went to the Nazi camps, if you went through Hitler's camps, you could get the best orchestras in the world. They were full of unbelievable musicians, unfortunately, all the German concentration camps. But Stalin wouldn't let them touch the musicians. The singers, the vocalists, the instrumentalists, the composers, they were too important. Even though he went crazy in every other sphere, from architecture, design, all the way to poetry, and murdered one after the other, in the musical realm, he really appreciated the music, and they had these concerts in the Grand Kremlin Palace, which still exists today, and where Putin holds his ceremonial events. And they would play the violin or sing, and Stalin would get moist in the eyes. Yes?
Have you identified who actually wrote Lenin's last testament, which supposedly called for the removal of Stalin as general secretary? You identified several possibilities, I think.
Yeah.
And I couldn't decide whether you'd concluded who actually did it or not. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's a really big story, and I can't do the whole version of it, unfortunately. It's a sort of whole chapter of the book. Lenin has the stroke in May 1922 and will die in January 1924, but he's incapacitated from essentially that May 22 to January 24. He has a second stroke, a third stroke, and a fourth stroke, and he's ill the whole time, doesn't really come back to work full time, and is in an estate, a dacha, a country house in southeastern Moscow called Gorky, but not the writer Gorky. This is Gorky with an I, not a Y. And he's got doctors and he's got his family. He's got nurses and a couple of bodyguards and drivers. He's an invalid. He's in a wheelchair. He's paralyzed on the right side. He can't write and he can't really speak. And all his dictation begins to come out from him, calling for this and calling for that. And it's very suspicious. And it looks like his wife, Krupskaya, is interpreting his words. You know, sometimes you're married with somebody for a long time and they open their mouth and you finish the sentence and maybe you didn't get it right, but you for sure know what they think or what they should think. You guys don't notice? Come on. Am I the only one married in this whole room? No. So it's clear she's the only one who's bringing his dictation into the public realm. People who go visit Lenin have to stand outside, tell the wife what they want to tell. She goes inside, tells Lenin, and then she comes out with the answer. And so she is against Stalin being the sole heir to Lenin. And maybe Lenin dictated the document calling for Stalin's removal, and maybe she interpolated his thoughts on his behalf and brought it forward. And we don't know. You can't prove it in the end. And I don't come out one way or the other in the book, not because I'm wishy-washy. I may be wishy-washy, but that's not the reason. The reason is there's not enough documentation, and I stick very, very close to the documentation. So, the document from January 1923, the usual dating, calling for Stalin's removal. We have the doctor's journals talking about how Lenin had trouble speaking and couldn't really speak. So it looks like the wife was involved in that. And it's a failed plot against Stalin to remove him, but it haunts him because Stalin is Lenin's heir, Lenin's successor, Lenin's pupil, and everybody is whispering about this dictation from Lenin calling for Stalin's removal. And Stalin resigns again and again. And the Lenin Testament, whoever dictated it, whoever produced it, haunts him his whole life. In fact, we're 62 years since he died, and we're still talking about this Lenin Testament. It's going to haunt forever because it's about usurpation. It's about Stalin's illegitimacy. Because if Lenin called for his removal, he's not Lenin's real heir. And that's what the whispering was in the party. And it ate away at Stalin's soul.
So we'll never know.
Well, there's no document. There is no Lenin Testament document. So I think that's what you know. That's a lot to know already.
A question, you've talked about people who rise above history, and so I have a question for you about Mao, which I know will be in your third volume.
Yes.
And in the, say, 1945 to 49 period, as the future of China clarified, did Stalin still believe that Mao was going to be a fellow traveler in communism as he had apparently he perceived him to be up until that point, or was he afraid he would become more of a nationalist and branch away?
Yeah, so that's a big one, too. All these little, tiny, uncomplicated questions from this audience. I really like that question also, and it's a very fraught relationship. You see, this is volume 3, but Stalin has a mini stroke, or maybe even a major stroke in 1945 after the victory of the war. The war destroys his health, and he disappears for 3 months after the parade in 45, after the victory parade. And he's never quite the same. His last 8 years of his life, he's 5 months of the year in Sochi. And he doesn't come to work every day, even the days that he's in Moscow. And Mao is this young, vigorous figure. Mao is clearly much younger than Stalin. He's had his own revolution in China, and he's going to eclipse Stalin. The subtitle of the third volume is The Mao Eclipse. And Stalin can feel and see this coming. And it also eats at him, because Stalin has not really had that much competition. The Trotsky thing he dealt with, right? Hitler, that was a much bigger deal than Trotsky. Not a phantom, but a real enemy. But he beats Hitler. And by the time Hitler's done, there's really nothing. Tito gets under Stalin's skin. Stalin breaks with Tito. Tito doesn't break with Stalin. So it's really just the Trotsky, Hitler, and Mao. Those are the three figures in Stalin's life that shape him as a rival or a foil. And the Mao one is the hardest one in the end because Stalin sees his mortality and sees Mao's vigor. So when Mao makes his first trip to Moscow to see Stalin after the victorious revolution, Stalin has him cool his heels for 3 months before he receives him. And Mao, what choice does he have? You know, Stalin is his breadline, is his military and financial supply line. So there's Mao, who's this unbelievably big figure, having to wait day after day, week after week, to be received by the great Stalin. So you can see this. Stalin is trying to take the measure of Mao. At the same time, he's jealous of Mao because of Mao's youth and vigor. And you can see Mao, he's got the long game. He's playing the long game. And by the time Stalin dies and you get Khrushchev, who's this pygmy? This is Mao. I dealt with Stalin. And I'm going to now talk to this pygmy Khrushchev? Are you kidding? What did he do? Stalin at least, murdered millions like me. And Khrushchev, what is that? And so that's you're going to get the Sino-Soviet split when Mao basically going to spit in Khrushchev's face. But Mao is a really big figure, and like Hitler, he's really the only other person that you can put in the same sentence with Stalin, historically, unfortunately.
We are down, unfortunately, to the last question. This has been an amazing talk, by the way, just fantastic. You are going to come back for volume 2 and 3, right? Yes. See, you all heard it.
Thank you.
Very quick, very easy question, and then, as I said before, there are books at the front, and Professor Keimer will be happy to sign them up here.
I'm not sure this is worthy of the last question here, and I almost changed over to a music question on Shostakovich or whatever, because I found your comments so interesting about Stalin and music, but I'm going to resist that and ask a more general thing. Kind of on a theme that you've addressed a little bit, but I still don't get it. Your presentation was sort of 3 parts. The first, the acquisition of power, which sounded a lot like a kind of an obsession with the idea of power, and then the Minjinsky story, which is more an obsession with power, but maybe for an obsession with survival rather than just obsession with power for the need to survive. But the third part was all about political goals and so forth, collectivism and so forth.
Yes.
And you've already said that even though the conventional view is that he sort of took on the trappings of having political goals later, and kind of denied that. But is there any real evidence in the earlier part of his life, in this either the first century of the century, first decade, or the second decade, or whenever, that he had any reason to have a sort of communist zeal or anti-capitalist zeal?
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to answer that in 2 parts. Another excellent question. So the first part is that, I go for the evidence. And so there's a lot of firsthand evidence in real time. There's not evidence later on. We have people who survived this guy get into the emigration, and then 30, 40, 50 years later, they remember that when they were in 7th grade together, Stalin said he was going to murder everybody. Or they remember when he put the cat in the microwave and they could see right away he was weird and was probably going to collectivize agriculture. We have a lot of that evidence. Some of those stories could be true. Some of those reminiscences in old age of Stalin's youth could be true. But I don't use them. I use only the real-time recordings of people who were close to Stalin, observing him. In 1918, in Tsaritsyn, a White Guard general, somebody who served in the Tsarist army, works with Stalin for a while with the Reds, and then defects to the Whites. He writes a first characterization biography of Stalin, and it's really incisive. I use that. The guy who was in charge of Stalin's personal dictatorship, the head aide, the number 1 aide, Nazaretian, the Armenian, from the Caucasus. He's left a lot of stuff about 1922 Stalin, what it was like to work for him. So that's the Stalin I try to give in the book. The more original, in real-time documentation I can give, I hope, the more the reader can say, I can finally understand this person, I can feel this person. I can see this person. You know, evil is much more interesting when it's human. Caricature evil is much less interesting, right? But let's get to the I said that's one part I'm going to answer. And now here's the second part of the answer. This is where we'll end. So let's remember, what's his youth like? We have a picture. You see, because he becomes a murderer, a murderous tyrant, people are looking for stuff, evidence earlier in life. And they think he had a really bad childhood. They think it was very violent there. They think his father beat him. There's all sorts of stuff which is not documented, which I go through very carefully in the book. So we peel those barnacles off the ship. All that comes off. And now we're going to look at what we actually do know. And some of the barnacles may come back if they're verifiable, and a lot of them won't. This is what we know about his childhood. Because of the Orthodox Church, there was a school in the town he was born in. Not every town had a school. It's a very small town, but because of the church, he can go to school. And he does go to school. And he's one of the top 3 pupils in the local school, in the elementary school. And as I said, the teacher's pet, sings in the choir, and wants to join the priesthood or become a monk. As a result of which, when he's offered a spot in the capital, then called Tiflis, now called Tbilisi, at the seminary, he jumps on it. He's also one of the best students in the first, second, and third year of the seminary. Top grades, teacher's pet. You know what teacher's pet means. That's the snitch. You know, that's the one who says, you know what Billy and Jilly are saying? And the teacher says, no, what are they saying? And that's the teacher. So he's the teacher's pet. He's also the best singer again. He's a fantastically good, successful student. And then what happens? He gives it all up for the pursuit of social justice. He goes into the revolutionary underground to overthrow the Tsarist regime because it's oppressive, and it was oppressive. It was a horrific regime. And he's going to dedicate his life, and the next 17 years of his life, actually a little bit more, 18 years of his life, he's going to have no money, no job, be in prison, be in Siberian exile, constantly fleeing and getting caught again and trying to escape the police. He lives a life of penury and imprisonment with no trade, no money, no future. And he never gives up the revolutionary path. He was on a path of success, good grades in school, teacher's pet, priest or monk. Even if he didn't become a priest or monk, he would have become a teacher. Right? He would have been first a village teacher and then maybe promoted to a higher teacher. He was a success, and he threw the success away. Why? Because he wanted to build a personal dictatorship? It was because he wanted to realize himself. He wanted to be a significant person, but not a significant person within the system, but to overthrow the system. And he does engage in a lot of revolutionary activity that's kind of borderline terrorism, because the Tsarist regime didn't allow legal politics. And so to fight the Tsarist regime, you had to use some of the methods against the Tsarist regime that they were using against you. The extremism of the Tsarist regime produced an extremist underground revolutionary movement. And he's dedicated to that with all the fibers of his soul. And people are killed. His closest comrade, Lado Ketsavelli, who's the one who introduces him to Marxism, dies at a young age in his early 20s. Because the police shoot him. And that's one of the risks that Stalin is incurring. And so from an early age, right, from the late teenage years at the seminary, when he begins to read Darwin and Marx and begins to agitate, in the Rothschild oil refineries and other things in the Caucasus, to organize worker demonstrations, May Day movements, he's committed to social justice. His life does not bring social justice about. The solution that he introduces to bring about social justice is more unjust than what he was fighting against. That's tragic. But the idea that he was committed from an early age to social justice is clear as day in the source material. It's clear as day in the book, and it's weaving through as he's building the personal dictatorship. It's not power for power's sake alone. It's power to realize the kingdom of heaven on earth, paradise, socialism, the end of exploitation, the end of imperialist war. They don't get there. That's not what they produce. The regime produces the opposite of its intentions. It's a tragedy, the tragedy of the left, right? But the idealism is deep, and it's mixed in with careerism, it's mixed in with cynicism, it's always there, but it's not that part that's surprising. Not the fact that he's a little bit cynical or he's a little bit mendacious. He's a politician. What's interesting is the idealism, and he keeps that idealism. He's late in life still editing Marxist texts, writing and editing Marxist texts. His Lenin and his Marx have little white pieces of paper in them where he needs to find the quotes. You go to his library, and there's 100 pieces of white paper in every volume of Lenin and Marx's collective works that he's put himself in there. So that's a big story of ideals and idealism. You can't understand him or the history if you don't factor that. It's not the only part of the explanation, but without that, it's just the old story of power for power's sake and sadism and stuff that just, it doesn't comport with the source materials. Are we good?